We're on.
It should be live. We're gonna wait 1 minute till 9 a.m. and then we'll start our presentation. All right, well, here we go. It is 9 a.m. My name is Brandon Slater, the past chair of the Chico Chamber of Commerce, also the chair of the Advocacy Committee. And the reason we're getting together here today is that there's a ballot, or two ballot measures actually going to be on the ballot this coming March. It's measures O and P. And it's in regards to Valley's Edge, which is a master planned 1,400 acre master planned community that's right off of Skyway, 20th Street. And essentially a yes vote means that the project would continue down its path towards getting built out as a master planned community. A no vote would mean that it would stop and pivot to something else that we will likely be discussing here today. So the reason why this project or this initiative, this measure is important to the Chico Chamber of Commerce is over the last several years, we've been hearing, and it's been one of our top priorities and complaints from our members, that housing availability, there just is not enough housing available for people who are working for our members, and that's been a detriment to our members. So a potential 2,700 housing units of the project is significant. So that's why we feel it's important to discuss the project here and kind of educate everybody on what's being said out there and just talk about everything going on. So without further ado, Mike Egbert is the chamber CEO, president and CEO, and he will be moderating today, and he's going to introduce our panelists that we've put together to answer a series of questions that have been either submitted by our members and the advocacy committee. So Mike, go ahead.
Get a couple of things out of the way before we introduce the panel. Just some legalese here. I want everybody to know that the content in this webinar is proprietary, intellectual property of the Chico Chamber of Commerce. So all of the information, materials, and resources being shared in the webinar, including but not limited to presentations, documents, discussions, they're all protected by copyright and intellectual property laws. Any unauthorized use, reproduction, distribution, or disclosure of the webinar content in whole or in part without the express written consent of the Chico Chamber of Commerce is strictly prohibited. This includes, and it's not limited to, copying, modifying, sharing, or adapting the content for commercial or non-commercial purposes. So that's where we start. Also, it's important to know that this is a Q&A between our panelists. And so we will not be responding to any audience raised hands throughout this process. And so everyone understands it is being recorded and it'll be posted at a later date for review if you'd like to do that. We've got an excellent panel today, and I'll start with introductions. First, Brandon Vieg. Brandon?
Thank you, Mike, and good morning. My name is Brendan Vieg. I'm the Community Development Director for the City of Chico. I oversee then planning, building, housing, code enforcement, and GIS. Honestly can't believe it, but I started with the city about 20 years ago, and I've primarily been involved with long-range planning for the city. I was the project manager for the city's 2030 general plan update, which was adopted in 2011. And I was also the lead planner for large master planned areas like the Northwest Chico Specific Plan area, as well as Merriam Park. Prior to working for the city, I was an environmental planner overseeing complex CEQA projects in Northern California. And I also served as a watershed coordinator for stream restoration efforts that benefited anadromous fisheries on Butte Creek. I wanted to just add to my introduction that as a city employee, I'm not here to promote or advocate a partisan position or otherwise seek to influence voters in any specific way. My goal in participating on this panel is to remain impartial and to focus on providing relevant information and facts that might aid voters in reaching an informed decision. Thank you.
Thank you, Brendan. Our next panelist is Ed Mayer. Ed?
My name is Ed Mayer. I'm the Executive Director of the Housing Authority of the County of Butte. We're a nonprofit public agency serving Butte County as our jurisdiction. We operate the federal Section 8 and public housing programs. We serve about 3,000 households, lower income households in Butte County. Our mission is to provide affordable housing opportunity to the citizens of Butte County. I'm an architect and an urban planner by training, and I have direct experience in urban growth issues in Anchorage, Alaska, Missoula, Montana, Santa Cruz, California, and of course here in Butte, all of which are ecotopias. So happy to be here today. Thank you.
Thank you, Ed. Our next panelist is economist Robert Eiler.
Hi, folks. My name is Robert Eiler. I'm president of Economic Forensics and Analytics, a consultancy here in California. And I'm here because I do a lot of economic development and housing analyses around the state.
Thank you, Robert. Our next panelist is Jim Stevens. Jim?
Yeah, thank you, Mike. Good morning. I'm Jim Stevens. I am recently retired from a 40-year career with a local engineering and surveying and architecture firm called North Star, where my primary obligation was to advocate for development projects and in the Chico area, in Butte County, and in the surrounding counties and as far south as Sacramento. So I've been involved in this game for a long time. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Jim. Our next panelist is Brandy Laffins.
Hi, my name's Brandy Laffins. I am a real estate broker with RE/MAX of Chico. I have been a realtor for over 20 years. I was raised by a realtor, and I am homegrown, born at Enloe Hospital in 1970.
Thank you, Brandy. Our next panelist is Tony Scott. Tony?
Good morning. I'm Tony Scott. I'm the current vice chair of the Chico Planning Commission, former chair, and I think right now the longest serving member on the Planning Commission.
Thank you, Tony. Our next panelist is Annabelle Grimm. Annabelle?
Good morning. My name is Annabelle Grimm. I'm the general manager for Chico Area Recreation and Park District, otherwise known as CARD, and I'm here to talk about the open space and parkland.
Thank you, Annabelle. Our next panelist is Bill Hack. Bill?
Good morning, Bill Hack. I'm the former fire chief of the city of Chico, also the cities of Rockland and Lincoln, been in the fire service for 25 plus years. It's interesting being back on this type of panel because in my prior career, I was an urban planner. I'm here to talk about the fire safety issues.
Thank you, Bill. And our final panelist is Joshua Pierce.
Hi, everybody. Good morning. I am, for the purposes, I wear a few hats, but for the purposes of our discussion today, I'm a sustainability and energy consultant, have been for the last 18 years, working with municipalities, counties, state government, and investor-owned utilities, developing energy efficiency and decarbonization programs, often for disadvantaged, hard-to-reach or rural communities. And prior to that, I was in the construction and solar industry internationally. I'm also 40 plus year resident of Chico, Chico High, Chico State. Go Wildcats.
Excellent, thank you. So let's get right into the Q&A. Back to the beginning, we'll start with Brendan. Brendan, what is the general plan, the special planning area, and how does Valley's Edge fit in?
Right. So I'll try not to get in the weeds, but this is, I think, important context. So as required by the state, every jurisdiction in California must have a general plan, which is supposed to serve as the local government's long-term framework or constitution for future growth and development. The general plan also just represents the community's aspiration for its future and intentions for community development. It contains a significant amount of goals and policies upon which the city council and the planning commission make land use decisions. It's made up of a collection of elements, but I think we would more normally refer to them as topical chapters from a book. There are 9 mandatory elements or chapters, including land use, circulation, housing, conservation, open space, noise, safety, environmental justice, and air quality. And all those different elements must coordinate and work together towards what I'm going to share with you is on the screen, the land use diagram. The land use diagram is found in the land use element, and it's a map or a figure that reflects the city's future physical development pattern. Chico's land use diagram includes 5 special planning areas, also referred to as SPAs. That designation identifies areas that were determined to have significant new growth potential, but that would require very detailed subsequent land use planning in the form of either a specific plan, a plan development, or some other type of comprehensive planning effort. The SPAs were intended and are intended to help Chico meet its long-term housing and jobs needs, and they were established strategically based on a number of criteria, including strategic locations within the planning area, proximity to services, ability to advance the general plan goals and policies, compatibility with adjacent uses, and also considering environmental constraints. One key factor about the special planning areas were they were not to be homogeneous land use types, but were to be developed as connected and complete neighborhoods with a mix of residential densities, employment opportunities, services, retail, parks, and open space. And the master planning effort was intended to establish the land use and circulation patterns, but also consider the infrastructure and financing issues. So in the general plan and in that land use diagram, there are 5 special planning areas that were identified. There's one called the North Chico, there's South Entler, there's Belle Muir, there's Diamond Match, which is also known as the Barber Yard site, and then there's the Doe Mill Honey Run special planning area, which is in fact the Valley's Edge specific plan area that we're discussing today. Valley's Edge happened to be the largest special planning area, and it's also the first SPA to go forward with master planning as directed again by the general plan. There's additional direction in the general plan for how Valley's Edge should build out, but what I would like to share is that city staff, the planning commission, and the city council all agreed that the Valley's Edge specific plan was consistent with the vision that was laid out in the general plan. Valley's Edge proposes up to 2,777 dwelling units with a wide range of densities and would allow up to 447,000 square feet of commercial development. The remainder of the area, of course, is parks, open space, public facilities, and also circulation infrastructure. So Valley's Edge is a master planned area that would build out over several decades, similar to Cal Park did 50 years ago, as well as the currently actively developing areas of the Northwest Chico Specific Plan and Marion Park areas that were approved back in the mid-2000s. So that's just some good context for what a general plan is, which again, we've just scratched the surface, but also the special planning areas and how they were identified and the process by which they were supposed to go through in order to be areas that would meet our jobs and housing needs in the future.
Great. Thank you, Brendan. The next question is for Jim. Jim, opponents claim that Valley's Edge will create a traffic nightmare, specifically mentioning Bruce Road at Highway 32 and 20th Street. They cite between 23,000 and 30,000 trips per day. Proponents say the city's infrastructure plans are designed to handle this kind of traffic. Which view do the facts support?
Thanks, Mike. I think that this is a very interesting question. The 25,000 ADT, which is short for average daily trips, which is the contention here. Sounds like a lot. It sounds like a really big number, but actually it just reflects the count per day of the vehicles going by. And I can share with you a couple of perspectives. The Esplanade now has approximately 25,000 ADT. And I think the highest count in Chico is the stretch of East Avenue between the Esplanade and Highway 99, and that's 32,000 trips per day. Now, we all think that's kind of crowded, but this is coming from the east side of town and it's coming into town. And so it's kind of expected on a development of this size. And I agree that the proponent's contention that this is planned for that. As you can see on your screen, there are a couple of study areas, or one study area of all the intersections directly related to the Valley's Edge development. And those have been analyzed on their existing condition for ADT and performance, and on their existing condition plus the project. This is all part of the environmental impact report that the city has contracted with an independent consultant. On the other side is the planned roadway improvements, numbered 1 through 19 or something like that. And those are construction obligations that Valley's Edge is obligated to participate with as a result of the impacts based upon their project. And the analysis is such that once Valley's Edge begins, and they will begin generating traffic fees, which each building permit requires, they're going to generate something in the around $2 million in traffic fees that will go towards these improvements over time. Now, remember that the 25,000 trips or so is a horizon number of when it's completely built out, and that is looking at 15 to 20 years ahead. Now, through the EIR, they have concluded through these studies that the road improvement mitigations that all of the studied intersection will operate at acceptable levels of service, and all of the roadway stretches will be adequate for the anticipated traffic. So all the bottom line on that is that the consultants conclude that with the mitigations based upon the fees, then the traffic impact to the city of Chico will be less than significant. Now, one more important point is that due to its planning for the Valley's Edge project, and the other speakers will get into that, it has both commercial, retail, entertainment, and school opportunities very close by. And that's a long-term goal of most planning projects, in that we achieve what's called trip capture. And that means vehicles don't need to leave the project for basic services and entertainment. And the analysis in this case, it says that Valley's Edge can achieve a reduction of about 15% of ADT over the life of the project. Without these housing opportunities, there's going to be people required to commute into Chico, as Chico is the region's largest employment center. And what happens there is we're going to get the same increased congestion, and we will have the same wear and tear on our street network, but none of those folks will pay any fees towards mitigating that, as Valley's Edge will. Thank you.
Thank you, Jim.
Mike, before you move on, it would be all right if I just touched on a couple of things that Jim mentioned. So, in my role, I like to look at the numbers. And so in the traffic study that Fair and Peers did for the city of Chico, as Jim mentioned, there was a determination that by the design of this project, it would reduce the vehicle miles traveled, what we call VMTs, by just under 15% without any additional mitigations. I think it's important to talk about what that represents, because it speaks to Jim's comment about people driving in. So 15% reduction in vehicle miles traveled is about 13 million miles of driving a car per year, or the equivalent of just over 1,100 gas-powered cars on the road. That's a pretty big number. And the reason for that Jim touched on, which is its proximity to the Southeast Chico Regional Commercial Area, which is one of the largest employment areas north of Sacramento, also speaks to the senior housing component of the project. Seniors and retired folks tend to travel much less, about half as much as working folks. He already spoke about the diversity of land uses on the site, which creates a sort of job housing balance. Jim spoke to that in terms of trip capture. And so to put one more number, and then I'll let you move on. That number of 13 million miles traveled is roughly approximate to the number of miles that would be added in terms of greenhouse gas emissions or an equivalent amount of CO2 if just 1,000 people that would have otherwise lived in Valley's Edge have to commute in from Oroville or Gridley or neighboring communities. So that number gets flip-flopped in Jim's scenario there. Thanks for your time.
Great. Thank you, Jim. The next question is for Brandy concerning mix of housing. Brandy, opponents say that Valley's Edge is luxury housing for wealthy out-of-towners. Proponents say Valley's Edge is planned for a range of housing types to serve local market demands. So which is it?
Well, if you, and I don't know, Brandon, if you can put up the graph that shows the different, the numbers of what will be being built. Thank you very much. What I did was, well, first of all, we often hear, I've heard this for years when I am at somebody's home, and maybe it's an upper end home, a home in Canyon Oaks or something that's a little more expensive, you know, $8,000 or higher. And people say, well, I'm probably going to get a buyer from the Bay Area, right? Because they can live in a 1-bedroom, no bath for 1.2 million, but buy a mansion in Chico for the same price. Honestly, I mean, I don't have statistics on this, but I don't hear that happening that often. People live in the Bay Area because they want to live in the city and that lifestyle, and that's where their jobs are. So I do think that's a little bit of a falsity. What we see is people that are typically buying a home in Chico are either moving up because their family's growing larger and they need more room, or they're downsizing. So it's most likely when somebody is selling a home that their buyer is going to be already living in Chico. So there's that. Then what I did was I ran some numbers through our local multiple listing service, and I broke it down into 3 different price points. And it looks like they target right on exactly. So I took what has sold in 2023. And between 0 and 400,000, we had 32% of the market. And if you look at the entry-level home, that'll be about 34% of what Valley's Edge is for that price point. The next level was 400 to 700,000. Last year in 2023, that was about 56% of our market. So a little bit lower than what Valley's Edge is proposing. And then the last one is the luxury home, if you will. And in 2023, that was roughly 12% of our market. So sales happen in what the market is predicting, what the community wants and what the community needs. So that middle price point there, those single family neighborhoods seem to be the most popular, and that is what most people are looking for. So just given these numbers here, it's right on point for what we would want in terms of, or need in terms of that price point, that luxury price point. The majority is exactly where we need it. And we still have it's a supply and demand problem. We still have multiple, even given the interest rates, we are still seeing multiple offers on some of these properties. We only have about 125 homes for sale in Chico right now, and we've had this problem for quite some time. I think in 2009, 10, 11, we had around 500 homes for sale. But really, we've had a supply problem for a very long time. So that's what I see. We need more housing on every different segment of the market.
Great, thank you, Brandy. Appreciate that. Tony, the next question is for you. Proponents say Valley's Edge implements the general plan, which is designed to promote smart growth. Opponents say it's for all. As chair of the Planning Commission, you recommended the council approve the plan. Why?
Well, thank you. Yeah, I think one of the things that's good context about the projects that come to the Planning Commission is really those are projects that have a balance, that we're really weighing what the benefits are to the community versus any negative impacts. If we go back to what Brendan talked about in the first question, thinking about the general plan, for me, when I look at this housing project, and I look at the months and months of meetings that the community had, the incredible community outreach and community engagement, where we said, here are the areas that we want to grow. The idea of the general plan really is to prevent sprawl, that we are building homes and developing in areas that are suited best for our community. And so we have a project here with Valley's Edge that fully aligns with our general plan, where we said we wanted to grow. That is something that builds on those years and years of discussions. It falls right within one of those 5 special planning areas. And so for me, that balance of saying, where do we want to grow? This fully aligns with that. That's why I supported Valley's Edge in our vote. I think the other thing to really keep in mind with Valley's Edge as well is looking at any of the kind of mitigating factors that the Planning Commission had to consider. There were only 2 in the environmental impact report that were significant and unavoidable. That was the view shed and traffic, which the experts creating the environmental impact review said would happen anywhere with this type of project and with this many homes. So really, when it came down to it, for me, we're weighing the impact of a view shed as opposed to a 600 acres of homes, 2,777 dwelling units, to meet the needs of the community in a place where we said we wanted to grow.
Great, thank you, Tony, appreciate that. Brendan, coming back to you. Opponents and proponents seem to agree that Chico needs more housing. Opponents claim infill, as in build up, not out, is the key producing housing that locals need. Proponents say infill plays an important but relatively limited role. What's Chico's plan for housing production?
Well, all this talk about general plans is pretty exciting for a planner here, so I'm just glad that everybody finally cares about what I do for a living. So after the campfire, I shared some information with the council because there was such a demand for housing. And so one of the key tenets I wanted to highlight was that folks need to understand that city government generally does not produce housing. There are different roles played in the housing development process. The city's role, of course, is to, at least our role in accommodating growth, is to identify an adequate supply of appropriately zoned land, to provide infrastructure and municipal services, and also to hopefully create an environment where development can proceed expeditiously. It's then, of course, left to the private sector, where physical development housing is driven by market conditions and willing landowners. Back in 2018, the city prepared a land absorption study that estimated the demand for and supply of developable land in the city's sphere. This was done as a kind of a gauge on how our general plan was performing, and we wanted to make sure we had adequate supply of land. The study broke available land into 4 categories. There was a category that we called pipeline, which was proposed and approved projects that had already been entitled. There was also an inventory of vacant developable land. There's the 5 general plan special planning areas that we keep referring to, Valley's Edge being one of those. And then there's also 14 opportunity sites identified in the general plan, which are areas that were determined to have kind of a high redevelopment potential. And those might be our old transportation corridors like Upper Esplanade or Nord, Mangrove, but also the downtown and the Vanilla Orchard. The 4 categories represent what I like to call a mosaic of potentially developable land. But again, it's important to note that the timing of private development is driven by a number of very complex factors. It's including demand, willing property owners, financing, infrastructure obligations, state and federal permitting, availability of workforce, cost of materials, and again, the list goes on and on. There's a great deal of uncertainty. So as I mentioned before, the city doesn't dictate the timing of residential development. And I have to share that the pace of smaller vacant infill projects as well as the redevelopment of underdeveloped areas in Chico, is fairly inconsistent and is also very unknown. So again, while I believe infill and redevelopment are very important, they're very important contributors to residential demand in Chico, it's in fact the larger master planned areas like the Northwest Chico Specific Plan Area, Oak Valley, Marion Park, all areas that were entitled back in the 2000s that provide the greatest consistency and known development potential on a regular and annual basis. What's key for the city's plan for meeting residential demand is that we wisely use the total supply of land outlined in the general plan. And the one clear way that council can show its support for continued housing production is honoring that general plan, specifically acknowledging that the land use diagram, which we showed earlier, represents where the community has agreed it will focus growth.
Great. Thank you, Brendan. Jim, did you have any more for that?
I'd like to jump in on that. Thanks, Mike. In looking at infill as opposed to master plan communities, there are lots of issues that come up here in Chico. And Brendan touched on it. It's individual construction on smaller lots is much more expensive than master planning a community and being able to take advantage of the economies of scale and construction in planning, in the construction of the home, both the homes and the roads. He also mentioned about willing sellers, and in my experience, there's not enough willing sellers to accumulate a sufficient amount of projects to make it affordable these days. Small infill 1 and 2 lot homes are fine, people can do that, but if we're going to increase let's say the density of a specific area all within the general plan, and we've had lots of iterations of attempting to do apartment complexes in Chico. This is a particularly difficult one, where we'll try to do a 20 or a 30 or a 40 unit apartment complex in a neighborhood that has single family homes. That the local opposition to such a thing, because it's not like my place, is incredibly difficult to overcome. And our firm was involved in at least 4 wherein that they took this process through 2 or 3 years of entitlement effort, countless hearings, meetings, and then have just abandoned their effort to do it because it just doesn't pencil, it doesn't work. There's also the other problem with open space as opposed to doing a master plan community like Valley's Edge, is that there's no opportunity to take a cumulative look at the impacts. You do anything you do in a traffic analysis of a 2 lot subdivision, a 2 lot parcel map, a small apartment complex, it looks at the micro environment right around it. It doesn't look at the big picture. But if we were to get 2,800 units built on infill only, then all of that analysis that was in the previous slide showing that the roadway widths, the intersection study, that wouldn't be available for analysis of where to build, and it would be just kind of haphazard development. There would be no public space granted in small developments, open space. There'd be no protections of the trees other than a specific list of trees, and there'd be no reduction of the VMT and the HGH greenhouse gases that Josh alluded to in small, because it's not, you can't achieve that with small development. So infill is just a difficult thing right now. I think it's necessary. I think we need to continue to encourage it, but it's not an answer to the housing shortage or the affordability.
Thank you, Jim. I'd like to bring in economist Robert Eiler now. Robert, you can give us some perspective on how housing shortages impact and shape communities.
Thank you, Mike. So folks, Brandy had said this before about supply and demand. In many ways, it doesn't have to be more complex than just thinking through that lens. So if you think about what it does, it's going to increase the local cost of living when there's a housing shortage. It will reduce housing choice in the sense that when you have a housing shortage, it usually means that there's some shift in the mix of demand versus what's supplied. And then you have this sort of race to whatever units are available, especially in the single family home market, because that's where people are moving from rental to purchase, and thus in essence moving from rental to investment. So when you see that for a community, those are kind of the first two places. But I usually think about housing in a little broader sense, in that you need to think about it as an economic and workforce development asset. If you lack housing choice and you have a shortage of housing, where you're going to struggle is in attracting and retaining and expanding businesses in their hiring, because you won't have the housing to provide growth for a workforce. And then that can slip over into economic development, and the two feed off of each other, and it's sort of a chicken and egg problem. And housing is what I kind of consider to be the third leg of a stool on which a community is built. You have the economic development, the workforce development, but you lack infrastructure, specifically housing, the stool will tip over. So a lot of it also depends on the cost. So if we think about how Butte County, and I also try to think more regionally about housing, if you think about what's happened with Butte County and the shock of the 2018 fires, that shadow effect remains, but now there's a second shadow effect in terms of what the pandemic has done. And if you look at housing shortages in a place like, let's say, the core Bay Area, and looking at San Francisco, the pandemic in some ways relieved San Francisco of some of the building pressures over a couple of decades. That was a slow moving wave of housing shortage issues. And now they're seeing single family home prices fall, rental prices somewhat stabilized, but they've lost population as a trade-off on that. So that's what they're going to go through over the next 3 or 4 years in San Francisco, is going to be a thought about, when people move into San Francisco, are they ready to work in a local business? And if not, how does that shift the demand for services and the other parts of our economy in terms of what incomes can be generated, the other types of jobs? And that's why they're all interlinked as assets to each other. And that if you have one that is slipping in terms of its ability to support the community, the others might fall. And in fact, if you look at the latest data, the permit data in Butte County has been slipping since the peak, and it's sort of this immediate rebuilding surge that took place. That is all kind of slipping back down, a lot of it because you've seen the cost of construction rise, interest rates are rising or have increased. Those factors have now acted as headwinds on continued growth. So projects like this need to have the incentive to go through, and then they need to have sort of the benefits being reaped in the broader community once done. And you want to see developers wanting to put this kind of supply into the mix. The trick is how it also supports those other pieces, because that's how housing shortages, if they get somewhat relieved, can start to reap more benefits for economic and workforce development.
Great, thank you, Robert. Appreciate that. Randy, let's bring you back in. Opponents claim Valley's Edge isn't needed because there's plenty of vacant infill available for new housing. How much residential land really is on the market today?
Well, I think Robert sort of touched on this already, and Jim as well. There's not a lot available, actually. If you look at, a single family lot where you can maybe put one home, we do have some of those scattered throughout. We have a total of, if I search our MLS, of 54 various types of lots available, not just residential. I did not see any in our MLS. I know there's maybe one potential on LoopNet available, but other than that, there's really nothing for sale that would increase housing as much as we need it to, as much housing as we need. And if we look at when people talk about affordability, and I know I'm maybe getting a little off the topic of this specific availability question, but when we look at affordability, if we have low supply, the prices are going to go up or stabilize. And again, that is what has happened. So back to the inventory issue, we need the inventory to hopefully stabilize pricing and actually make them more affordable. I don't know of anybody that's planning on building homes in the 300,000 range, or condos or townhouses. And that is what we need. So this to me is, unless there's some other plan out there or builder out there that's planning on doing that number that I'm not aware of, this is exactly what Chico needs in terms of what the community is looking for to purchase. Whether it's buying their first time home in that $300,000 price range, or somebody that's downsizing, selling a larger home and buying something smaller. But back to that question, we just don't have the land. It's not available that I am aware of. So.
Great. Thank you, Brandy. Brendan, back to you. Opponents say Valley's Edge is just too large. It's the size of Gridley. Why in special planning areas does the city require large-scale master planning? And what are the alternatives to planning large-scale? Brendan?
Okay, thank you. So I want to be clear again that a lot of us see development through the lens that we're used to, but Valley's Edge is not a subdivision that will be developed over several years. It's a master planned community entitled with a specific plan that would more likely develop over about 3 decades, if not more. So as opposed to smaller development proposals that proceed piecemeal, one project at a time, master planning gives us an opportunity for kind of looking at things thoughtfully and considering land use, open space, resource protection, infrastructure planning, as well as public facilities all simultaneously. So the general plan says for large areas identified for growth that master planning, again, will provide an opportunity for community participation and input into the vision for that area. We have a very active community, and again, I think it was Tony that shared there was a lot of engagement from the Valley's Edge project of the community. Cohesive and contextual planning and design that considers the landscape and geography of an area. Again, not just one project at a time. Comprehensive understanding of circulation and utility infrastructure needs and the location of that infrastructure. An early identification of supporting community facilities like schools, fire stations, and parks, all things that are contemplated as part of Valley's Edge. Thoughtful preservation of open space, incorporation of environmental conservation, and then one that I think is very important, which is an opportunity for streamlining of the development, of the future development, through that large program level environmental impact report. Again, a lot of the development we see today is taking place in areas like Marion Park, Oak Valley, Northwest Chico Specific Plan. Those were areas that had a large environmental document prepared. The CEQA is done, so subsequent projects can tear off of that. So ultimately, master planning provides a kind of a unique opportunity to consider the development of the area holistically. And again, that's what the city's general plan both desires and directs. So really, it's a great opportunity to look at an area holistically and not do things piecemeal and ad hoc.
Thank you, Brendan. Robert, opponents say Valley's Edge will be a burden to infrastructure and ultimately the taxpayer. Proponents say that it'll create significant economic benefit to the city and the community. This is what you do for a living. What do you say?
So I did look at the report, the economic impact report, and it's done in a classic way. It's very well done. It almost describes this sort of industry that will be coming to town once building starts, and it's going to provide this sort of ripple effect. And that's really what those economic impact reports do, is kind of explain a ripple or multiplier effect from the engine that will be coming to town. And thank you, Brendan, for putting those up. So this is in essence a summary of all that. The critical factor when you think about the fiscal impact that will come from sales tax revenue, property tax revenue, and concentric circles of sales tax and property tax revenue beyond just the core project and then the resident, is how the city and county spends that money in terms of the community. So it is hard for any economist to look 10 or 15 years down the road and know what a city or a county is going to do with revenues that are coming in based on a specific project that's built, the residents that spend money in the local community, and then what other vectors might come and affect the local community. That at the end is really the key factor. But I usually try to think about this in terms of the forecasted benefits per person. If that is augmenting what the current situation is based on the number of residents and the amount of total fiscal impact that's coming, that's part one. Part two is, what's it going to do for local workforce and local economic development? Does it enhance some of the movements that have been coming and some of the planning that's there, and in a sense complement what is coming? As discussed before, if you're facing a housing shortage, new housing can provide a little more flexibility in what you offer new employees, new employers, if they want to move to town or expand. And those are kind of some, I wouldn't say indirect, because that kind of mixes and matches the terminology in an economic impact report, but some of the intangible effects on communities when you have more housing and how those economic impacts affect the local community really come in sort of the vibrancy that you feel, because there's more bodies, there's people that say, hey, now I can find workers in terms of employers, and that spending kind of acts as a lubricant for growth.
Great, thank you, Robert. Let's switch gears a little bit and talk groundwater and bring in Josh again. Opponents claim Valley's Edge residents will reduce groundwater recharge and add to aquifer overdraft. Proponents say studies demonstrate impacts on groundwater are not significant, and that water usage is both regulated and responsible. What do the facts support?
Thanks, Mike. First of all, I want to start by saying I think it's totally reasonable that as citizens, we should all be concerned about water supply in California, Northern California. I think we can all relate to worries about water, especially when we have cyclical droughts. So to best answer this question, I think the context really matters. And by context, I mean the actual numbers as determined by several independent expert studies, making up thousands of pages of documentation. For the general Northern California area, we live in an area that is surrounded by the Vina subbasin. That's our big deep water aquifer. And the study that relates to the plan's impact on the future of Chico's water supply. So from there, we can discuss the project's impacts and what the specific plan actually mandates for all of the future builders and all of the future residents to do to conserve this precious and limited resource. So in those numerous studies evaluating Chico's water supply, these studies do confirm that there is an adequate water supply for the entire project as well as for the Chico district over a 20-year horizon. I think it's important to note that this also represents, of all of the groundwater that is used in California, all domestic uses represent about 10% of the total water use. The rest of it's used for the very, very important job of raising food for our state and for the rest of the country. So don't take my word for this. Let's look at the studies. EKI's independent report on the water supply conducted for Cal Water, which is our regulated public utility that would supply water to this project, states in its summary on page 25 and also in section 4 that across a 20-year time horizon, which is sort of that 20 years represents an aggressive build out. If they were to basically just start building this and continue building across any economic cycles we might have at 20 years, that there will be more than adequate water supply to serve the district, including Valley's Edge and the additional specific planned areas that were mentioned earlier in this conversation. The second is the city's, or set of documents are the city's Chico Urban Water Management Plan as of 2020, updated in 2020. Like the general plan and Chico's own climate action plan, which I was a member of the commission for, the project's conservation and water efficiency measures, what it's doing to reduce the per capita consumption, mirrors the efforts recommended or required in these really important local planning and policy documents. So, there's the context. So now that we understand that there's adequate capacity to serve this project, let's talk about the question regarding aquifer recharge rates and the question of where people might live otherwise and what that would mean for the use of water in this same aquifer. So just briefly, recharge is just a fancy way of saying surface water that makes it down into our shallow and then deeper aquifers, like rainwater or irrigation, and then making it back into our water supply. Based on the EIR soils report, Valley's Edge is mostly located on lava cap. It's called the Lahar flow. It's basically impermeable. Water doesn't make it, very little water makes it through. The report states about 95% plus or minus of that surface water won't infiltrate into the aquifer on site on Valley's Edge because of that, of the poor soils and the very impermeable soils on site. So in my mind, as I looked at this, the question seems to be, how do we maximize recharge on site given this, significant limitation? In the plan, surface water flow is directed into existing swales, and it's in those swales where there might be some opportunity for recharge, which is really the only place that recharge can take place. And then finally, on the issue of location, where would people, what would happen to Chico's water supply and the region's water supply if people lived elsewhere? The entirety of Butte County and some areas of neighboring counties draws its groundwater from the Vina subbasin aquifer. So we all share the same water, and Cal Water draws its water out of the ground from deep, deep wells. So one of the impacts could be if people are forced to live outside of the Chico area, live in the county, they may be drilling wells. If they're drilling wells, that's going to be pulling water from a much shallower aquifer, which is much, much more susceptible to things like seasonal drought. Well, I hope that answers the questions. Yeah, I want to make sure I make enough time.
Thanks, Josh. Appreciate it. Jim, tree preservation has been a question. Opponents claim that development in the area will destroy up to 2,000 mature trees. Supporters say the plan prioritizes tree preservation. Which is it and why?
This is an interesting question because Chico is a city of trees, and we've cherished our tree canopy and want to encourage as much tree growth and tree maintenance as possible. And one of the benefits of having a master planned community like this is that we can look at a 10,000-foot view of the impacts and see how can we manage the existing urban forest, if you will. And what Valley's Edge plan does is dedicate approximately half of the total area of the project into a permanent managed open space, which immediately protects some 4,400 trees. Further, the development regulations for future construction of roadways and housing has some other specific development requirements. And that is that if there's two things. One, you're to avoid existing trees as much as possible. Up at Valley's Edge, the majority of the existing tree canopy is blue oaks and other various oak trees that are strong enough to fight through the impervious surfaces, as Josh just mentioned. But in order to take those trees, in order for construction of homes, this assumes that people aren't smart enough to avoid the trees, because trees are a wonderful benefit, and those are all probably between 100 and 150 years old up there. If they do take trees, there is a replacement ratio of 9-to-1 with this in the regulation. So if you take 2 trees out, you have to replant 18. And there's also success criteria that you have to monitor the growth of those trees for 5 years and they're going to ensure that they're going to be healthy. So over the course of the project, there's going to be some 7,000 other trees planted on top of the existing, 4,400 that are protected. So after halfway through the development, I think there won't be a time when there's less trees existing than there are right now, and it'll only get larger than that. Thanks.
Thank you, Jim. So let's talk parks and open space. Annabelle, it appears about half of the project is dedicated to open space and/or parks. Will these be open to the public or only available to the people who live in Valley's Edge?
Thanks, Mike. Yeah, that's a great question. Like all other card parks, the parks and open space at Valley's Edge would be open to the public.
Perfect. Right to the point. Thanks, Annabelle. Bill, let's talk wildfire risk. Opponents say Valley's Edge, the area is burned in the past, and building there will expose more and more people to wildfire risks. Proponents say that they've worked with fire professionals, and development there actually reduces Chico's exposure to wildfires. What say Chico's former fire chief?
Well, let's just start off with, we live in Northern California, and California in general. Wildfire has been part of the state forever. And for someone to say just because a piece of land has burned in the past due to wildfire that we should never be able to build on it is frankly ridiculous. We wouldn't have any building in the state of California under those premises. The key is, as we noticed, we live in California, so there's always going to be the risk of wildfire. And the key is, how do we reduce those risks? And it's crucial to highlight that this development has been specifically designed and constructed with an unwavering commitment to that fire safety and community risk reduction. They've undertaken rigorous measures to ensure that it's going to be built to the highest standards, higher than the requirements of the law, utilizing fire-resistant materials, implementing comprehensive wildland mitigation strategies. It's disappointing when people try to utilize the shared memory of the tragic days of the campfire to try to sway an argument outside of the facts. And the facts of the situation here are this development has done a fantastic job, better than I've seen in my entire 28-year career, of mitigating those risks ahead of time, because it's almost impossible to mitigate them after building has occurred. And this specific development has gone above and beyond. They've utilized every mechanism possible to reduce that risk, and it's going to be a fire-safe community. Doesn't mean that there's not going to be risk of fire. I lived in the middle of the city of Chico, and I was at risk of fire. It just is what it is. But the key is to minimize it as much as possible, and to do that early in the process. And they've done that. They've exceeded all standards.
Thank you, Bill. Let's talk affordability. Ed, opponents say less than 1% of the housing in Valley's Edge will be affordable, and we take that to mean subsidized. Proponents say while they voluntarily committed to some subsidized housing, zoned and shovel-ready vacant land creates additional opportunities for subsidized housing. Ed, what's your take?
Thank you. So the Housing Authority's concern is providing housing opportunity to the community. Our focus really are the lower income cohorts, but we can't address our lower income cohorts and demographics unless we address the entire market. So first of all, the Housing Authority is a public entity. We have no official position on Valley's Edge one way or another. I reflect what Brendan said earlier as a public entity. But our mission is to provide some information, and we have some good information here that may put this into context. First of all, Chico, it grows. And Chico has been growing at a very modest rate for years and very consistently, usually about 1.5% to 2% per year. Well, if you look at that, that means we're doubling our population every 30 to 50 years. That's not a very long time to double the population of your community. And if you sit here today and ask where another 100,000 people are going to go in Chico, you begin to understand what we're talking about here, which is, in the affordable housing business, we rely upon a steady and predictable supply of land zoned and available for multifamily. That is something that is just simply not available in our community. We've had chronic housing shortages for years, if not decades. We have a shortage of multifamily housing appropriate for our low-income populations. We are about to hit a demographic wave of seniors who are aging out of the workforce, and they all need affordable housing in small units. So this issue of supply and demand is very important. In the absence of subdivisions like Valley's Edge or planned areas like Valley's Edge that provide for this predictable growth, what ends up happening is that we end up in a circus of deficiency. We can't find land to develop. We can't keep up with our clients. The lower income populations who are distressed in this county, we have high concentrations of elderly and disabled. They find themselves in housing distress, if not the streets. So the 2,770 units of Valley's Edge housing, what does that represent? Based on our growth rate, we need to produce about 600 units of housing in Chico every year. Most of the time we do not do that, so we're falling behind. With Valley's Edge, talking about a 20 or 30-year development build-out horizon, it's actually at 2,770 units, about a 4 to 5 year supply of housing for Chico. So it's just a small piece of a much bigger picture, ironically. And again, our concern is not just low income, elderly, and disabled on passive income, where our concern is also workforce housing, make sure that the households that live in this community can actually afford to live in this community. Right now, we're working a game of musical chairs. It's very simple. If there aren't enough houses in the community, those who are least able and least capable are the ones who lose out on finding housing. It's no wonder we have elderly and disabled on the streets, it's simply a matter of housing supply. Valley's Edge is a housing supply vehicle. It's consistent with the general plan. So the information speaks for itself. Thank you.
All right, thank you. I appreciate that. Tony, opponents say Valley's Edge will destroy nearly 570 acres of native grasslands and other natural habitat. Proponents cite reasons why the directed future growth to grasslands east of Chico, including preservation of the Green Line. When tracking Chico's growth, how does the city and its planning process determine what habitat should be protected and what habitat can be changed.
Thank you. So, I mean, that's one of the things that I love about city planning and love about local planning process is as much as you have individual planning commissioners who are brilliant put onto the planning commission, once they are seated in that seat, their charge is really to take off the hat of their personal feelings and really put on the hat of the lens that we're looking through on what are very objective documents and principles that we need to use to make decisions. So part of that is the general plan. Another piece of that is really the expertise and the guidelines that we have set on certain planning regulations. We talk about design regulations, and environmental species are certainly part of that. So what a project that of this size has to do is essentially do a formal process of saying, what are all the environmental impacts? That is not something the city of Chico does. That is not something that the planning commissioners weigh in on. This is something that is dedicated to experts who know exactly what those species are that should be protected, that will be impacted or won't be impacted. And so really when you look at Valley's Edge, again, I bring up that EIR found only 2 significant and unavoidable impacts, viewshed and traffic. They did look at quote unquote oak woodlands and grasslands. What the draft EIR said is that it is not considered a significant impact because the community is not considered a sensitive natural community. So essentially, trees are, there's no equality of trees. There's no equality of grasslands. Certain grasslands and certain trees are sensitive and certain ones aren't. That is not a definition that I gave, that the city of Chico gave. That is a objective definition that we have that guides city planning throughout the state of California. So this report said those are not sensitive. One thing I do want to add is all of this documentation, all the reports, everything that went into the decision is fully available to the public. The city of Chico has done a fantastic job putting every single document on the website so that you can go through the city of Chico's website and read the draft EIR for yourself, read the final EIR, read the staff report that has, how many acres of land, how many units. You don't have to rely on anything that we're saying today or any rhetoric that you might hear out in the public. You can read all of those documents for yourself and make a decision based on your values and how these documents line up with how you would vote on this.
Great, thank you, Tony. Brendan, back to you. So there's a debate over who initiated Valley's Edge. Under whose leadership, commission and council, was Valley's Edge put into the general plan as a special planning area? And what were the community's expectations as expressed in the general plan for the 1,448 acre area?
All right, thank you. I had to look this one up. This was back in 2011 when the general plan was adopted by the council. In the acknowledgements page of the general plan, on council serving as mayor was Ann Schwab. We had Vice Mayor Jim Walker. Other council members included Andy Holcomb, Scott Grundle, Mary Flynn, Mark Sorensen, and Bob Evans. And then there was also some acknowledgement for some of the council members that were heavily involved leading up to adoption, and that included Larry Wall and Tom Nickel. And then on the planning commission, we had Dave Kelly as chair, John Mers, Kathy Barrett, Dan Ullman, Ken Rensink, Mike O'Donnell, and Matt Jewell Darlington. And again, heavily involved prior to adoption was Mary Brownell, Susan Manazian, and John Luvas. I will point out the general plan update was a long and involved process, 3 years. And in the end, it's a compromise. Again, some of the questions today is infill or new growth. And I say both. And that's what the general plan calls for as well. To your question about what were the community expectations as outlined in the general plan, it was for a recreation-oriented mixed-use development, offering a broad range of housing types and densities. The general plan called for a village core, retail along Skyway, a community park, neighborhood and pocket parks, open space areas, public uses, including possibly an elementary school, which we now know is part of the plan, and preserve areas that respect the creekside corridors. The general plan also called for roadways and trails and bikeways to be integrated into the natural landscape that would ultimately connect those residential areas to the parks, open space, the offices, the public facilities, and the core itself. There was also direction for the site planning and the building design and the landscaping to help minimize visual impacts and also to address wildland fire considerations. And then finally, there was direction for lighting standards to be developed to address dark sky concerns and again, visual impacts. And I'll share again, as I shared earlier, that staff, the Planning Commission and Council all determined that the Valley's Edge achieved those expectations. Thanks.
Great. Thank you, Brendan. We're almost finished. Jim, Plan B. Opponents hold that Valley's Edge can and should remain an open space. Others say if Valley's Edge is overturned in March, by right, the entire 1,448 acres could be subdivided in the county as a private gated subdivision with upwards of 70 20-acre estate ranchettes with no open space, no parks, and no public uses. Is that a legal or even conceivable outcome?
Yes, it is. First of all, to address the contention that it should remain natural open space, is kind of blind to the fact that it's in the city's sphere of influence, and which means on the big picture that it's anticipated for development eventually. All of the analysis that were prepared for the general plan documentation and the establishment of this Chico sphere of influence anticipate future development, as many of the speakers have said is desperately needed around here. So I think to say that it should be remained in natural and open spaces is kind of impossible unless those folks wish to purchase it and preserve it, which is not likely, because as an economic entity, its highest and best use is for development. That said, it currently resides in the county. It's not been annexed into the city yet, and the current zoning in the county is agricultural 20-acre minimum parcels, which allows one parcel per one building unit per parcel, plus the state allows an additional dwelling unit per parcel. So you could theoretically get 70 to 72 parcels actually, because if you're over 20 acres, it falls under a different category in analysis as a parcel map rather than a subdivision. The downside to that for the community is that it reduces the inventory being provided significantly, and it doesn't obligate any further, very little further analysis from an environmental perspective. So there'd be no way to mandate any public open space. There would be no means to mandate protection of any trees, and it basically cuts it up into ranchettes, and there'd be obviously no affordability with something along that. The likelihood of developing that, seems to me, would be to take the easiest route first, which would take the area all along Honey Run and put 20-acre parcels along that stretch, which would therefore eliminate any future access or any future development that would provide public spaces. So while it's not the best plan, ideally, by any stretch, it is possible, without a doubt. Thanks.
Thank you, Jim. Appreciate it. Final question, open to everyone. And if you want to have multiple responses, please take your time. We'd like to hear from anybody who wants to comment. The question is, if not here, where? And if not now, when? There's an old saying, communities choose what they want to be. Reacting to the no growth school of thought, if the people's will through lawsuits or the ballot box is to stop Chico's new growth areas, what's the future look like?
So I might just want to add some just information about my role when I served as the project manager for the general plan update. And again, over that 3-year period, there was significant discussion about new growth areas that would break the green line. And I mean, significant, real conversations when we were putting together the preferred land use alternative. And there's a recognition that there has to be compromise. And if we value our agriculture and those incredible soils, we may need to look to the east or to the north and the south. And so there will be another general plan update process. And again, these areas will be tested because I regularly hear, and you heard today, there's not enough land to develop to meet Chico's both residential and non-residential needs. I believe there is currently, but those questions are going to come up again. And if not here, then where? And I guess the answer is yes, there can be more infill, there can be more redevelopment. But that's again not dictated by the city. There's not a specific cadence or process by which that occurs. We need to have a mosaic. And again, there aren't areas that are closer to the city's core. And beyond this, besides looking past the green line to the ag side, or just moving north and south along the Highway 99 corridor. So the general plan again says if we're going to use these areas and if we're going to incorporate them into our sphere, let's use them wisely and let's develop them intensely and let's develop them correctly so that people aren't always having to get in their vehicle and drive from single family use to their commercial centers. The goal, of course, is to have a mix of use and to incorporate them on top of each other so that people are closer to the needs of their daily needs. So I don't know if I answered the question. I just know that in my role, working for the city and working on long range and growth issues, this is an area that through a compromise was identified to meet our needs into the future. And that doesn't mean within the next 3 years, 5 or 10, we're talking, as Ed pointed out, over 20, 30, 40, 50 years.
Thanks, Brendan. Anyone else like to jump in?
Yeah, if I could jump in too, thinking about that future and taking off the lens of development. One of the things that I am a huge proponent of is the local planning process. I believe in it. I trust in it. I see that there are, like Brendan said, huge opportunities for community input. The ability to sift and leverage the information that's in front of us at multiple levels of approval or denial, but multiple levels of input and decision making. One of the things that I think when we go to the ballot box to vote, to me, it's not a question on yes or no on this specific development. It's a question of, do I, Tony Scott, as an independent average citizen in Chico, have the right to really push aside any of the expertise and the planning that has gone into this project to say, I don't want this. And that's something that I really struggle with this is what is that dynamic shift as far as the local planning process when we start putting private property decisions in front of voters?
Thank you, Tony.
I'll jump in too, Mike, if you let me.
Yes.
And I think that Tony's point is outstanding. It is something that all of the development that has occurred in the 50 years that I've lived in Chico has occurred through this planning process. where developers take significant risk with their capital to go through the process that is very specifically laid out. And if you follow that and you provide a project that's consistent with the obligations that the general plan and the city's ordinances require, a reasonable expectation is that you can go forward. And that has happened here. And now it's I like your reference to ballot box planning, which has limited vision, if you will. It is a reaction immediately and not looking long term. And my fear is that if this becomes an effective means of opposing projects, especially well-planned ones like this, it just makes all of the concerns that Mr. Mayor and Mr. Eiler pointed out about the future, looking 50 years. Chico's is going to grow. Historically, it always has. We are the employment center of this whole Northern California region. And so the growth is going to bring demand, which only increases prices. You know, a wise person once said, nothing got less expensive by making less of it. And that's my fear with housing in Chico. And, you know, you can take that fear to the extreme and see that without housing opportunities being available in Chico, and the demand continues, the price increased, this lower income cohort that Ed is trying to support just gets flat out priced out of the area. That's what's occurred in places like Carmel, where they don't grow anymore and everything is just crazy through the roof. I think we need to take a long-term view here. Thanks.
Mike, if you might add on to Jim's comment for a moment, if I could. I sort of 2 points here. Tagging on to Jim's comment, I was actually in San Luis Obispo this last weekend, which is a community that 20, 30 years ago when I was growing up was often compared to Chico. Similar populations, both college towns, beautiful natural surroundings. The average price in San Luis Obispo, which spent 20 years, massively restricting growth, is $995,000 currently, which is over twice the average price of a home in Chico at the moment. So we can think 20, 30 years down the future, and if we completely restrict growth and don't allow any growth, what will happen to affordability in Chico? So that was sort of point one. The second point is, in my role as a sustainability consultant, my job is often not to advise on if or why, but how. And so one of the lenses that I look through when looking at a project or trying to support other projects is, how is development taking place? And so I would just point to, if not here, where, and if not now, when. Also, if not this, then how? And Valley's Edge does a number of things that spurred me to want to participate in this forum. It's protection of up to 50% of natural open space, specifically the design multi-uses, the fact that it is the only all-electric planned community, which is a direction that California has mandated it has to go. When you look at these things as being built into a 20-year time horizon for construction, that's not something that I have seen in the North State ever, certainly not north of Sacramento. So I think it's important to just look at, if we're looking at alternatives, to consider those factors.
Thank you.
Can I just say one thing? Listening to Jim and Josh makes me think of time. And had this project been happening 5-10 years ago, maybe our pricing issue wouldn't be here right now. I mean, it just seems, again, the inventory issue has kept prices rising, and there's no sense that prices are going to drop. So just wanted to get that 2 cents in. Hearing when you talk about those other communities, it's sort of, I hadn't really thought about that. That was a really great point.
Thank you, Brandy. Anyone else? All right, I think we've concluded our Valley's Edge question and answer session. I appreciate the participation of all the panelists, Brendan Vieg, Ed Mayer, Robert Eiler, Jim Stevens, Randy Laffins, Tony Scott, Annabelle Grimm, Bill Hack, and Joshua Pierce. Appreciate your time and your input. And again, for everyone else, this will be posted as soon as possible for review, and you can comment then. Thanks, everyone. Appreciate your help.
Have a good day. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.